Did you know when a buyer places an offer on a home and a seller responds with a counteroffer, they have the option to use two different forms. One of those forms is a lot more advantageous to a buyer, and one of those forms is a lot more advantageous to a seller. Now, which form is which and when do you use it? That's what we're going to talk about on today's episode. Hi, I'm Josh Alexander, your host of Orange County Housing Market News, your one-stop shop for all things Orange County real estate. So today we're going to go over the different options sellers have to issue counteroffers to buyers when they're first trying to negotiate getting into escrow. So let's go ahead and get into it. So before we go over the two different types of counteroffers sellers are able to use depending on the circumstance, let's first do a quick review on why sellers issue counteroffers to begin with. So a seller is going to issue a counteroffer basically to change any terms in the contract they didn't like that the buyer gave to them. So yes, the first one that pops into your mind is always going to be the asking price. So sellers can always ask for the buyer to come up in price. However, oftentimes you're going to see a lot of other terms in there as well that the seller wants to change. So for instance, maybe the buyer only wants to put $3,000 into escrow at the beginning as their earnest money deposit. Maybe the seller wants them to put $5,000 or $6,000. They can put that in the counteroffer. Maybe the seller wants them to reduce or remove some contingencies. They can put that in the counteroffer. Maybe the seller wants a longer escrow period so they have time to find a new replacement property of their own. They can put that in the counteroffer. So basically anything in the original contract, they can try to change it to give them more protection, more flexibility, or more profit at the end of the day when everything is said and done. So now that you had a quick refresher of what a counteroffer is and what you can expect to see in a counteroffer, now let's go ahead and go over the two different types of forms that the seller can use to issue that counteroffer and the two big differences between them. So the first form is going to be called a seller counteroffer form, and the second form is going to be called a multiple seller counteroffer form. So the first major difference between the two is with a seller counteroffer form that is only issued if there's a single offer on the property. So as a buyer, if you get that seller counteroffer form, you already know that you're the only offer on the home, which is going to give you a little bit more leverage when you're doing negotiations back and forth with the seller, because you know that if they don't accept your offer, they're back to square one and they're going to have to go find another buyer for the home. So typically when a seller issues that seller counteroffer form, they're not going to be as aggressive with the counteroffer, and on the opposite side, when the buyer sees that counteroffer form, they're not going to be as aggressive in pushing for all the terms that the seller is asking for because they have a little bit more leverage. Now on the other hand, the multiple seller counteroffer form is only going to be used, you guessed it, if the seller has received multiple offers. So obviously as a buyer, if you receive this form, you know you're going to be at a little bit of a disadvantage because there's multiple offers on the home and multiple buyers trying to compete for this house, because typically you're going to have to be more aggressive when you're seeing these counteroffers in order to make sure you have a chance of getting the home when you're competing with multiple buyers. So that first difference between the two forms is pretty obvious, and logically you can understand when a seller would use one or the other because it just depends on how many offers they got on the property. However, the second difference between these two forms, in my opinion, is much more important to pay attention to because not a lot of buyers know this information before they start placing offers on homes, and it could really set them up for disappointment. So when you're looking at that seller counteroffer form, which again is just a single offer on the property, if the seller issues that counteroffer and most of the requests seem reasonable and the buyer says, yes, I agree to everything, as soon as they sign that form and send it back to the seller, then they're legally under contract and they're going to open escrow on that house. On the other hand, and this is very important to understand, if the buyer receives a multiple counteroffer form, they could also agree to everything the seller has asked, sign it, send it back to the seller. However, the seller in this case ultimately still gets to choose who they go into escrow with. So even though the buyer agreed to everything, there could be another buyer that also agreed to everything, but on top of that, when they were issuing their counteroffer, said they would pay an extra $20,000 above whatever the seller was asking for and ultimately might get the home. And you can imagine the heartbreak that buyers are going to feel if they sign that form thinking they're about to go into escrow on their dream home, and all of a sudden the carpet gets pulled out from under them a few days later when the seller tells them, hey, I'm sorry, but you didn't get the home. We went with a different buyer. If you don't have the proper expectations set up and you don't understand the forms that you're signing, it can lead to a lot of disappointment, which is why I make sure that anybody that I'm working with understands the difference between the two forms before you even start looking for properties. And that way, when it comes up, you have the right expectations. So even though you might be excited and agreeing to everything if it's a multiple seller counteroffer form, in the back of your mind, you still know that you might not get the property because the seller is ultimately the one that gets to choose who to go into escrow with, even if you agree to everything. So I hope you found this information useful. If you did, please hit that like, subscribe, and that follow button below. And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to hit that bell button as well. That way you're notified every time a new episode is released. And until next week, stay happy, stay healthy, and I'll see you on the next show. Bye.